Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Legacy of Conquest, The Unbroken Past of the American West, by Patricia Nelson Limerick, PhD. Narrated by Pam Ward. Preface. This book, to start on a personal note, has made me happy. If we organized a nationwide scavenger hunt, and every participant rushed to the nearest university campus to find a professor who was discontented and even dismayed by the lack of attention paid to his or her publications, the race would be over as soon as the first scavenger hunter talked to the first professor. But the contestants would be well advised not to waste their time on me. There is a chance that I will spend my retirement in one of those glass-walled dioramas displayed at natural history museums. I will be placed in a replica of my cluttered study, and the wall caption will say, "Patty Limerick is the only known specimen of a university-based author who is entirely content with the visibility and impact of her published work. Sightings of other such creatures have been reported, but none have been verified by science." The existence of this book is no small miracle in itself. Few fuels for intellectual activity can match anger in its efficiency, duration, and renewability. So it was very lucky that 20 years ago the author of The Legacy of Conquest operated with a tank filled with this fuel, and also found unlimited opportunities to keep the tank topped off. An abundant supply of peevishness helps to explain the astonishing fact that an author not known for her ability to meet deadlines wrote this book in a couple of years and, just as miraculously, pushed perfectionist dreams aside and surrendered the manuscript to the publisher in a moderately timely fashion. By the early 1980s, I was convinced that Western American history was cheated of the respect and attention it deserved, and I had gotten it into my head that I could address and correct this situation. This was a fine idea, until I tried to put it into practice. Persuading readers to hold Western history in higher regard would require me to read widely in many fields, and then assemble these pieces and parts together into an overview of the whole territory. And this act of synthesis would require me to face and defy the demon known as scholarly specialization, a demon with a particular talent for eroding courage and draining the life force. Plus, I would have to court the wrath of my elders, and quite a few of my contemporaries, by making a claim for originality and fresh perspective, a challenge that a young, untenured, unpublished, thin-skinned female academic would have been well advised to duck. Doubts, second thoughts, and a recognition that I was in over my head periodically made me wish that I had had the sense to duck. But the project was saved by an abundance of occasions to get mad and fired up again. Consider a conversation from the mid-1980s when an ambitious and very status-conscious English professor was leaving the University of Colorado for a considerably more prestigious Southern university. "Now that I am moving to the South," he declared to a little group of us at a cocktail party, "I realize that I will have to do a lot of reading in Southern history and Southern literature." "When you moved to the West," I asked, "did you realize that you had to do a lot of reading in Western history and Western literature?" I thought I had asked a question that deserved an answer. My companions, including the professor bending low under his burden of weighty self-esteem, felt differently. To their ears, I had made a joke, since I could not possibly believe that a person of this man's intellectual caliber should invest his valuable time in reading Zane Grey, Louis L'Amour, and their historian equivalents, many of them based at podunk Western colleges. Southern history and literature were significant and prestigious. Western history and literature were lightweight and dismissible. Exchanges like this left me very crabby and very motivated. In these irritating conversations, I did not say, "I will show you," But that sentiment was front and center in my mind. When the demon of scholarly specialization came at me, pointing out that on every page of this book I was intruding on the turf of experts who knew these subjects far better than I could sternly tell the demon, "I cannot pay attention to you because there is something larger than my own fears at stake here." A powerful motivation had entered the picture. I had come to believe that the study of history could illuminate and improve public conversation and decision-making on controversial Western issues. This was urgent and important. The demon of specialization would just have to go find someone else to terrorize, and apparently he found no shortage of surrogates. That demon then handed off to the demon demanding linear argumentation, who fared even worse. Kind people have, over the years, asked the gentle, gracious, and sharply pointed question, "What exactly was your strategy for organizing this book?" The organizational strategy was a day spent on the floor in Boulder, Colorado in the summer of 1984. I took index cards, each bearing a favorite idea or story, and crawled around the floor, putting the cards in stacks. Big stacks became chapters. Smaller stacks went into boxes that eventually became hostages in the basement, where they still await rescue and redemption. The legacy of Conquest hit the streets in the summer of 1987. Western historians and the general reading public reached something close to perfect agreement in their initial response. They were underwhelmed. Attempting to raise my spirits, my wonderful, but perhaps excessively frank, editor, Ed Barber, as he contemplated a tepid review in the New York Times Book Review, reassured me with this memorable remark. "I think," he said, "that your next book will do much better with reviewers." It is, they say, always darkest before the dawn. And thank heavens this dawn came on fast. The legacy of Conquest came out of the shadows and insisted on its right to sit in the sun. In truth, at a certain point of national publicity and scholarly debate, sunscreen might have done the book some good. The book did, after all, have its lamentable flaws and omissions. It has been declared that Santa Fe, New Mexico was the longest-lasting Hispanic settlement in the United States, an assertion that did little justice to St. Augustine. This would be one among several demonstrations that I was perhaps a little too intent on accenting the early activities of Europeans in what became the Trans-Mississippi West. I have never doubted or questioned the importance of the history of Eastern North America, but I also felt justified in putting everything I had into shifting the center of significance westward. A number of commentators pointed out that it was odd to find a book claiming to be an overview of Western history that did not use the words Alamo or Little Bighorn, surely the two biggest celebrity events for the region. In fact, Legacy made next to no reference to wars or battles. I had made the conscious choice to stay away from the topic of the Indian Wars, telling myself that there was no need to dwell on this unhappy subject, since the tribes who did not formally fight the U.S. Army ended up just as conquered as those who did. When I later had to write an essay on the Indian Wars, I was awake at 2 a.m. for several weeks, looking at the ceiling and brooding about man's and woman's inhumanity to men and women, as manifested in the enthusiasm for inflicting trauma and puncturing the skin of others. When Legacy was criticized for being too negative and too grim, the charges seemed decidedly exaggerated, since I had sidestepped and evaded the most disheartening stories in the region's past. The critique that most surprised and instructed me came from urban historians who pointed out the absence of a reckoning with the role of cities in the most urbanized of regions. Surely they are mistaken, I thought. Surely I didn't revert and regress to that tired old idea that the real West is the rural West. But, alas, my urban-oriented critics had me dead to rights. I had reverted to the idea that the real West meant the rural West. Of course, this slippage did deliver a benefit, sparing my readers the burden of watching me flounder over the question, to what degree are the West's cities and suburbs distinctly regional in character? On the contrary, doesn't it seem that the ostensible Westerners in these cities and suburbs actively defy their locale, planting and maintaining lawns, following imported architectural models, and generally offering themselves as embodied manifestations of the phrase plunked down, and refusing to respond to their setting? But whatever their degree of failure to achieve native and authentic Westernness, cities and towns are key elements of the region's story, and it is a puzzle to me why I paid so little attention to them. And hindsight also declares that it would have been smart to include the fur trade. When reviewers remarked on its absence, I accepted their point. The activities of trappers and traders had dramatically rearranged power and resources in the West before the miners, settlers, and ranchers showed up, and an overview of Western history should have remarked on that. But over time, I have realized that writing about the fur trade would have given me the chance to reconsider the overly sharp categories for human identity that I took for granted in Legacy. In this book, I use the terms of ethnicity, Anglo-American, Mexican-American, Indian, African-American, etc., as if I were dealing with characteristics and qualities that were clearly marked, settled, and lasting. In what may well be the biggest change in my thinking since 1987, I now recognize that every human being is a mixture of categories and classifications. We do one another a considerable disservice, complicating our social and political conflicts, when we try to impose a sort of one identity per customer limit on our fellow humans. The preferred academic term for this recognition is hybridity, decoded from academies. Hybridity offers a welcome invitation to put the ethnic categories we take for granted through a constant process of reappraisal, acknowledging how much they are matters of mixture and change. The fur trade would have given me a great way to put forward this proposition. The trappers and traders were men, but women played a central role in their business and in the society derived from that business. Many European or Euro-American men took up, in varying degrees of formal marriage, with Indian women. The first advantage in recognizing this reality of the fur trade is that the image of the utterly self-reliant, single male fur trappers and traders is instantly rectified, as these men regain their context in the domain of family and human connection. The second advantage is even greater. With the interaction between white men and Indian women, the fur trade occasioned a mixture of populations that blurred the boundaries between the categories Indian and white. In very similar ways, trade relations in the 1820s and 1830s led to intermarriage between white men and Mexican women in New Mexico and California. Of course, going even further back in time, the term mestizo recorded the mixture between Spanish and Indian peoples that lies at the foundation of Mexican identity. I could have done myself, Western historians, and Westerners a service by noting and incorporating this factor of hybridity, and thus loosening up the rigid and persistent categories that humans use to exaggerate their differences. Writing a preface to a new edition of a book approaching its 20th birthday allows some exercise of hindsight and even self-reproach. But my contentment with the impact of this book overrules much of that second-guessing. The legacy of Conquest predicted a renaissance in the field of Western American history. The Renaissance happened. Humans are generally quite a failure when it comes to prediction, and thus I count myself extremely lucky to have had a prophecy prove out. I also count myself very lucky to have had the privilege of serving as president of the Western History Association in 2000. The transition from rebellious young Turk to established old bird was a rapid and sometimes disorienting journey. But the honor of being WHA president made the arrival of middle age into a much more bearable development. Sometimes condemned for its glumness and emphasis on the sorrows of history, the legacy of Conquest was actually a profoundly cheerful enterprise, full of optimism. I hoped the book would provide, so to speak, an over-the-counter remedy for the three big afflictions burdening the field. A focus on the westward movement of white men had obscured the fact that people converged on the American West from every starting point on the planet. The remedy was an easy one. Reallocate attention to minorities, Indian people, Mexicans and Mexican Americans, Asian Americans and African Americans, and pay attention to the difference between women's and men's experiences, whatever their ethnicity. Did I go too far in pushing white men to the margins of historical attention? I would be the first one now to say that the lives, actions, and beliefs of white men require our best thought, critical appraisal, and respect, which does nothing to lessen the historical significance of these so-called others. A misguided and widespread preoccupation with the end of the frontier in 1890 had broken Western history into two disconnected parts: the distinctive frontier West, sometimes known as the Old West or even the Wild West, and the homogeneous, just one part of the nation, West. Here, too, an antidote quickly offered itself. Recognize that the events of the 19th century shaped every dimension of Western life in the 20th, and now 21st century, and then put this reconnection to work in helping us understand our own times. The fuzzy and forgiving term frontier had drawn our attention from what westward expansion had meant to native people, as well as citizens of the Mexican North and to the natural environment. But a quick dose of honesty could cure this problem. Accept the applicability of the sharp and honest term conquest to the United States' westward expansion, and national self-understanding would be beneficially enhanced. Behind these diagnoses and prescriptions were two primary goals: to assert the value and vitality of the field of Western history by freeing it of tired and anachronistic habits of thought, and to present a more honest and revealing version of the past to public audiences, challenging the tyranny of academic jargon and specialization. The author of The Legacy of Conquest had quite a preoccupation with the historical pattern by which actions produced unintended and unexpected consequences. Thus, it was fitting, funny, and only occasionally maddening to see the book itself live up to its own theme, delivering unintended consequences promptly and mercilessly. The attempt to boot out the old orthodoxies almost instantly resulted in the installation of a new orthodoxy called the New Western History, which was pretty ironic in itself. But the second goal took a worse beating. In the years after the publication of Legacy, specialization and the habits of academic writers addressing an audience of other university-based specialists got a great boost. The Revolution and I sometimes marched in separate directions, which is not an uncommon experience for revolutionary advocates. Legacy came out in 1987. The New Western History got christened in 1989, and in academic circles the next 4 or 5 years could carry the label of the first crabby era. Some of the older, established Western historians were outraged by the challenges packed into Legacy, and they were unrestrained in sharing their outrage with colleagues and with reporters, emotionally defending their turf against the intruder. A few of them played a wonderful double-handed game, declaring first that the legacy of Conquest got it all wrong, and second, that there was nothing new in the book since they themselves had already said everything I had said years ago, and thus any credit for innovation should go to them. Happily, my sense of humor stayed robust and resilient, and I discovered a great personal enthusiasm for argument, debate, and adrenaline. In hindsight, it turns out that the era of my feistiness was also the era, by various measures and gauges, of the greatest pep in the field of Western history. Lots of public attention to the fight over the subject, the largest attendance at WHA meetings, a perception on the part of historians in other fields that the American West had come into its own as a vital field. And yet expressions of gratitude for the revival of the field were not free-flowing. The clash of egos and careerist ambitions seemed, for a spell, to have led to a goofy situation in which historians had upstaged the people of the Western past, who were ostensibly the subjects of our attention. But the good news was that university-based Western historians could no longer qualify for listing as an endangered species. In the years since 1987, a cascade of innovative and important books and articles appeared and made the recovery of the field unmistakable. The bad news was that this burst of energy seemed more and more directed toward an academic audience. The jargon of cultural theory and postmodernism was one source of trouble. The customs of universities and colleges in evaluating and promoting young scholars on the basis of their publication record and the appraisal of their peers reinforced the predilection toward specialization and narrowness. After an intervening period of comparative goodwill, the second crabby era broke upon us in the early years of the 21st century, as a group of mid-career scholars expressed their dismay over the backwardness of the Western History Association and put heart and soul into the production and sustaining of an academic tempest in a teapot. Or so it looked to me, anyway. The publication of The Legacy of Conquest brought enormous change to my life. The biggest change was that I got to find out what that interesting term public intellectual means in practice. When Legacy appeared, I had been an inmate of universities for nearly 20 years. Legacy changed all that, providing me with ever-increasing opportunities to apply historical perspective to contemporary Western problems. In 1989, the very accomplished law professor Charles Wilkinson and I co-founded the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado. In 1995, I became the center's faculty director and chair of the board. At the center, we have made a point of respecting widely varying points of view on the West's social, political, economic, and cultural changes. We have hosted Secretaries of the Interior Stuart Udall and Gail Norton, James Watt and Bruce Babbitt. We have placed next to one another at dinner tables the advocates of snowmobiles and the enthusiasts for natural sound, the proponents for wolf introduction, and the livestock raisers who see wolves as enemies. Plunging right to the heart of one of the most heated issues of the day, we have served as shuttle diplomats and ambassadors between natural gas producers and environmentalists opposing development on public lands. The chances to practice applied history have been astonishingly gratifying and instructive, even as this change in my professional life has put greater and greater distance between me and conventional academic life. And the distance is striking. In the early 21st century, public discussions in this nation operate with a more than sufficient supply of bitterness and friction. The forces for polarization are so fully staffed that, I finally concluded, polarization did not need my help. If I wanted to have a positive effect on public decision-making and the conduct of citizens and voters, then life as a public intellectual required me to put a lot less effort into contention and controversy and a lot more into forethought, self-restraint, tolerance, grace, and diplomacy. Outspoken and provocative statements are very fun to make, but I had given myself many opportunities to learn that the fun is rapidly followed by heavy labor in rebuilding bridges and making repairs. Effectiveness as a public intellectual, contrary to what I used to think and to what many academics still think, works best when you deny yourself the initial fun of unrestrained expression, think strategically before speaking, listen respectfully to your critics, and even, now and then, admit that they have persuaded you to change your thinking. Perhaps most disorienting for some who have puzzled over my change in methods, I reversed my conduct toward the Western myth. In countless showdowns and contests, the romanticized, commercialized myth of the West prevailed over my plucky challenges to it. After defeats beyond counting, a new strategy seemed in order. Why not try to co-opt the myth and enlist its endless energy for good causes? Moreover, why not even have fun with it? When I wrote Legacy, I doubt I owned a single item of Western wear. At the time of this writing, I am the owner of 5 pairs of cowboy boots, 2 excellent Stetsons, 1 white, 1 black, depending on the symbolic needs of the moment, 3 fringed jackets, 8 yoked Western shirts, 1 very beautiful bolo tie, and a couple of belts with magnificent buckles. While this is not exactly a circumstance on which the phrase, "even the devil can quote scripture," would have bearing, it is still evidence that even a famed one-time debunker of the Western myth can unleash her credit card in a Western wear store and, maybe, enlist the power of the myth in support of new causes. In 2005, I wrote a few essays as a guest columnist for the New York Times, the national public record appearance of the reconfigured, peacemaking, consensus-building Patty Limerick distressed and disturbed a number of readers. "You used to be a very good historian," wrote one disappointed soul. "What happened to that?" Answering that question might require a whole new book. In fact, the degree of change in my assumptions and practices may have been fairly modest. The last 2 sentences in Legacy can be read as foretelling my mild-mannered future. After listing the varied ethnicities and occupations of Westerners, I ended the book with this hopeful declaration. We share the same region and its history, but we wait to be introduced. The serious exploration of the historical process that made us neighbors provides that introduction. On February 1st, 2005, Jeff Limerick, my beloved husband, whose encouragement, wisdom, calm perspective, perfect pitch in respect for his fellow humans, and independent mind made the writing of this book possible, died from a stroke. I am grateful every day for the legacy of valued memories he left me, and for the legacy of this plucky, persistent, funny, and hopeful book. The serious exploration of the historical process that made us neighbors has given me the chance to introduce myself to hundreds of Western neighbors, and their friendship has sustained me. Introduction. Closing the frontier and opening Western history. Each age writes the history of the past anew, with reference to the conditions uppermost in its own time. The aim of history, then, is to know the elements of the present by understanding what came into the present from the past. For the present is simply the developing past, the undeveloped present. The antiquarian strives to bring back the past for the sake of the past. The historian strives to show the present to itself by revealing its origin from the past. The goal of the antiquarian is the dead past. The goal of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?